David Kamara never thought he would wake up to the sound of police sirens outside his apartment. But that cold, October morning, as he rubbed the sleep from his eyes, he saw red and blue lights flashing through his window. His heart pounded. Something was wrong. A sharp knock on the door. Then another, louder, more aggressive. "Open up. Police." David's hands trembled as he unlocked the door. The moment it swung open, 3 officers barged in, their hands on their holsters. "David Kamara," one of them barked. "Yes." His voice was hoarse, his mind scrambling for an explanation. "You're under arrest." The words hit him like a hammer. He staggered back. "For what?" The officer didn't answer. Cold metal snapped around his wrists. He tried to breathe, but the air was thick with something heavier than fear, an unspoken certainty. This wasn't a mistake. This was something worse. 6 months earlier, David had arrived in America with nothing but a suitcase and a dream. He was used to hard work. Back home in Sierra Leone, he had built his life from the ground up. But in the U.S., the rules were different. He worked double shifts as a mechanic, saved every penny, and stayed out of trouble. Then he met her, Susan Miller. She was one of those people who made you feel small without saying much. The way her gaze lingered a second too long, the way her lips curled into a smirk whenever she saw him. At first, he ignored it. He had dealt with racism before. But Susan wasn't just any racist. She was the kind that smiled while sharpening a knife behind her back. One evening, David was locking up the shop when Susan appeared in the parking lot, watching him. "You people sure work late," she said, her voice dripping with something bitter. David forced a polite nod. "Just trying to make a living." She chuckled. "Is that what you call it?" He didn't respond. He had learned long ago that arguing with people like her was useless. So he walked past her, keeping his head down, his pulse quickening. But as he reached his car, her voice rang out again. "You don't belong here." David froze. It wasn't just the words. It was the way she said them. Like a prophecy, like a promise. A chill ran down his spine, but he shook it off. Just another bad day. Just another bitter woman. He had no idea she was about to ruin his life. The weeks that followed were a slow descent into paranoia. He would catch Susan staring at him from across the street, see her whispering to neighbors whenever he walked by. His co-workers started acting strange too. Short conversations, avoiding eye contact. One night, he found a note taped to his car. 3 words, scribbled in black ink. "Go back home." David's hands tightened into fists, but he took a deep breath. He wasn't going to let this woman intimidate him. But then came the night that changed everything. It was late when he stepped out of the laundromat, his arms full of fresh laundry. The streets were quiet, the air crisp. As he turned the corner towards his apartment, he heard it, a scream. Piercing, desperate. His body stiffened. He recognized the voice. Susan. Then footsteps. Shouts. A car engine roaring to life. And suddenly, David was alone in the dark, his heart pounding with the awful realization. Whatever just happened, it was already too late, and he would be the one to pay for it. David barely slept that night. The scream haunted him, twisting through his mind like a bad dream that wouldn't end. He wanted to believe it was nothing, that it had nothing to do with him. But as he stepped outside the next morning, the street was buzzing. "Did you hear?" one of his neighbors whispered. "Susan Miller was attacked last night." David's breath caught in his throat. He kept walking, his hands tightening into fists. No, this can't be happening. At the auto shop, the tension was thick. His co-workers barely met his eyes. His boss, a gruff man named Hank, stared at him for a long time before muttering, "You all right, Kamara?" David nodded, but the feeling of being watched clung to him. The air had changed, thick with something invisible but suffocating. That evening, as he walked home, Susan was there, standing on her porch, her arms crossed, a cruel smile playing on her lips. He hesitated. She was supposed to be traumatized, wasn't she? A woman who had just survived an attack should look scared, shaken. But Susan looked victorious. Their eyes met. For a second, David swore he saw something. Something dark, something triumphant. Then she spoke. "You were out late last night, weren't you, David?" His stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" She tilted her head. "I saw you. You were lurking near my house." "That's a lie." A smirk crept across her face. "Was it?" David took a step back, the weight of her words pressing down on him like chains. He had known Susan hated him, but this was something else. This was a game, and somehow he knew he was already losing. 3 days after the attack, David came home to find 2 police officers waiting at his doorstep. His heart sank. "David Kamara?" one of them asked, his tone unreadable. David nodded, forcing himself to stay calm. "Yes, we'd like to ask you a few questions about the night of Susan Miller's assault." His stomach twisted. He had known this was coming. "I told you, I don't know anything." One officer exchanged a glance with his partner. "Then you won't mind coming down to the station." David knew he had no choice. At the precinct, they sat him in a cold, windowless room. Hours passed. Then the door opened, and Susan walked in, accompanied by a detective. She gasped, her eyes widening in exaggerated fear. "That's him," she whispered, clutching her chest. "He's the one who attacked me." David shot up. "That's a damn lie." The detective held up a hand. "Sit down, Mr. Kamara." Susan's voice trembled, but her eyes gleamed. "He was outside my house that night. I saw him." David's pulse pounded. He wanted to scream, to tell them she was setting him up. But the detective wasn't looking at him with doubt. He was looking at him like a guilty man. The room closed in. The walls pressed against him. David could already see it. The handcuffs, the judge's gavel, the prison bars. Susan had finally played her move. And now he was trapped. David sat in the interrogation room for hours, his nerves frayed. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the occasional scrape of a chair or the distant hum of a vending machine. He stared at the one-way mirror, knowing someone was watching, judging, waiting for him to break. Then the door opened. The detective entered, a folder in his hands. He tossed it onto the table, letting the contents spill out. Photos of Susan, bruised and battered. "She picked you out of a lineup," the detective said. "We also have an eyewitness who saw you near her house that night." David's blood ran cold. "I wasn't there." The detective leaned in, then explained this. David's world crumbled. He was losing more than his freedom. He was losing everything. The courtroom was suffocating. David sat in the defendant's chair, his hands gripping the cold steel of the table before him. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman with a voice like a blade, was painting a picture of a monster him. "He was seen near Ms. Miller's house the night of the attack," she said, pacing in front of the jury. "We have an eyewitness. We have physical evidence. And most importantly, we have the word of an innocent woman." David clenched his jaw. He wanted to scream that it was all lies, that the system was rigged against him. But his lawyer had warned him, "Stay calm." Susan sat in the witness stand, her voice trembling at all the right moments. "I was so scared," she said, dabbing at dry eyes with a tissue. "I thought I was going to die." The jury watched her with sympathy, their expressions shifting from concern to quiet rage as they turned toward David. He felt it like a storm pressing down on him, their unspoken judgment, the invisible noose tightening around his neck. Then came the so-called evidence. A shoe print outside Susan's house, size 11, just like his. A strand of hair found on her blouse, coarse, dark. His DNA, allegedly under her fingernails. "But that's impossible," David whispered to his lawyer. "I never touched her." His lawyer, a middle-aged man who looked more tired than determined, barely glanced at him. "We'll contest it." But deep down, David knew. This wasn't about the truth. It was about perception. The trial dragged on, and every time Susan spoke, her lies grew bolder. She cried. She gasped. She detailed a night of horror that had never happened, and the jury believed every word. Then the twist. As the prosecution wrapped up, David's lawyer stood, adjusting his tie. "We have new evidence, Your Honor," he said. "Something that changes everything." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge motioned for him to continue. David turned to see a young woman walk into the room. She was nervous, clutching her purse like a lifeline. "My name is Emily Sanders," she said softly, "and I have something to confess." She hesitated, then took a deep breath. Susan Miller paid me to say I saw David near her house that night. A gasp spread through the gallery. The judge banged his gavel for order. Susan's face drained of color. David's pulse pounded. Was this real? Was this the moment his nightmare finally ended? The prosecution scrambled, trying to discredit Emily, but the damage was done. The jury had seen the crack in Susan's perfect lie. And for the first time in weeks, David felt a flicker of hope. The case wasn't over yet, but now, at least, he had a fighting chance. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. The jury had been deliberating for hours, and each passing second felt like a lifetime. David sat motionless, his pulse hammering against his ribs. Then, the door creaked open. The jurors filed in, their faces unreadable. The judge turned to them. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreman stood. He cleared his throat. We have, Your Honor. David swallowed hard, his hands gripping the table. In the case of the state versus David Kamara, we find the defendant. The foreman hesitated, looking around at his fellow jurors before finally saying the words, not guilty. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. Relief flooded David's body. But before he could even process it, the judge's gavel slammed down. Order, he barked. He turned to David. Mr. Kamara, you are free to go. For the first time in months, David allowed himself to breathe. His lawyer clapped him on the back, but there was no celebration. This wasn't a victory. He had survived, but at what cost? Then the twist. Before David could stand, two immigration officers appeared at his side. David Kamara. One of them said, pulling out a document, you are hereby detained for immediate deportation. David's breath hitched. What? The officer tightened his grip. Your visa has been revoked due to criminal allegations. You're going back home. David looked at his lawyer, at the judge, at the faces of the jury members who had just set him free. But there was nothing left to say. The trial had ended, but the punishment had only just begun. David Kamara stood at the edge of the tarmac, staring at the land that had once promised him a future. The plane's engines were still roaring in the background as it began to taxi away, the final remnants of his life in America disappearing into the distance. His hands trembled, but not from the cold wind biting at his skin. It was the weight of everything he had lost. The dust of Sierra Leone's airport swirled around him, a familiar sight, but one that felt alien now. He had come here as a child, with nothing but a suitcase and a dream of opportunity. Now he returned a man, broken, misunderstood, and worse, accused of a crime he didn't commit. His heart felt like it was being squeezed by a vice, but he couldn't cry. Not yet. There was too much rage, too much confusion, and too much shame. They had stolen his future. And for what? A lie. A woman's word. Susan Miller's voice echoed in his mind, her shrill accusations replaying like a broken record. He touched me, she had screamed, her eyes wide with fake terror. It hadn't mattered that he had never touched her, never even wanted to. The word of a white woman in America held more weight than his own. He had learned that the hard way. The moment the police had arrived, he had known the game was rigged. As he was led to the detention center, his life reduced to a series of dehumanizing steps, searches, paperwork, and waiting. He had clung to the hope that the truth would come out, that somehow the lies would be exposed. But the system was designed to protect the accuser, not the accused, especially if you looked like David. David Kamara. The shout of an officer jolted him from his thoughts. He looked up to see a figure in the distance, silhouetted against the evening sky. The man was tall, dressed in the same uniform as the others who had escorted him here, but there was something different about him. A look in his eyes that suggested he wasn't here just to do his job. The officer stepped closer. You're from America, right? David nodded, unsure of where this conversation was going. I was. The officer stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to read him. Finally, he spoke. You don't deserve what happened to you. David's chest tightened. What are you talking about? You were framed, the officer continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. I know what happened. I know who made sure you ended up in this position. David's heart skipped a beat. This man was no ordinary officer. This wasn't a random encounter. What are you saying? "I've been following your case from the moment you were detained," the officer said. "Susan Miller, she isn't just some random racist. She's connected to a lot of people, powerful people." He took a step closer, his voice lowering. "She's been doing this for years, accusing black men, especially immigrants. They use the system to get rid of people like you, people who don't belong in their idea of America. And it's not just her. It's a network. They make sure you end up here, out of sight, out of mind." David's pulse raced as he processed the officer's words. His mind couldn't fully grasp the depth of what he was hearing. "You're telling me this was all planned?" The officer nodded grimly. "She was paid to do it. But there's more, David. You're not just a pawn. They want you out of the picture. They want to keep people like you down, hidden, quiet. You've seen how the system works, how they make sure it's impossible for someone like you to get a fair trial. And they've been doing it for years." David clenched his fists, the sting of betrayal cutting deeper than any physical wound. His whole life, he had worked for something better, for a chance to build a future. But the system had never been designed for someone like him. The legal system, the immigration system, all of it had been stacked against him from the very beginning. And Susan Miller? She was just one cog in a much bigger machine. "So what now?" David asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of fury and disbelief. The officer hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I can't do much from here. I'm just one man. But you have to know, you're not alone. There are others, other men like you, who've been through the same thing. They've been sent back, lives ruined, futures shattered. But it's not over, David. This isn't your end." David stared at the officer, feeling the weight of his words settle in his chest. He had been brought back to the place where it all started. But maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of his fight. A deep, hollow part of him longed to give up. The world had already shown him how easily it could crush a man who was trying to do the right thing. But another part, an ember deep within him, burned with the desire to fight back, to expose the truth, to make sure what happened to him never happened to anyone else again. "You said there were others," David said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Where do I find them?" The officer's eyes darted around, ensuring no one was listening. "You need to find the right people, the ones who know what's really going on. There's a network of activists, lawyers. They can help you take this fight back to America. It's going to be long, hard, and dangerous, but you're not powerless." David looked at him, a spark of hope lighting in his chest. This was his chance, not just to clear his name, but to expose the injustice that had ruined so many lives before him. He had been deported, but his fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. As the officer turned and disappeared into the shadows, David stood alone on the edge of the tarmac, staring at the horizon. His life, torn apart by lies, wasn't over. Not yet. He had been beaten, but he would not be silenced. He would rebuild. He would fight. And one day, Susan Miller would answer for the lives she had destroyed.